Hello, this is Dan Taverne, and this is my video defense of my paper written for PS660. My topic was anti-blasphemy legislation and religious intolerance in Indonesia and the implications for Indonesian democratization. Indonesia has been held up as an example of what a Muslim state can achieve in the way of religious pluralism and liberal democracy. However, there are significant challenges that Indonesia faces on the path to true liberal democracy. In fact, Indonesia, I think, is greatly limited by certain fundamental assumptions that are embedded in in the founding philosophy that undergirds the current government of that country. That is rooted in a philosophy called Pancasila, and one of the fundamental tenets of Pancasila is the belief in monotheism. And so right off the bat, as Indonesia kind of gets going as a democracy in the 20th century, it begins with a limitation upon religious liberty, truly, because anyone who is a pantheist or a polytheist or an atheist is going to be immediately opposed by that fundamental monotheistic tenet. And there is a great deal of persecution in Indonesia today. Now, most of that persecution, it would seem, is directed against other Muslims who practice differently than the Sunni majority in that country. One sect, the Ahmadiyya sect, has been the subject of a great deal of hostility. There have been assaults against individuals, arsons and destruction of property, and even murders. And so this group has been driven underground and then further limited by declarations from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And that's an irony in and of itself. You have to wonder about any country that has a government cabinet level representative for religious affairs. And what this apparently is doing is actually limiting and restricting religious freedom, not guaranteeing it anyway. So there are these significant hurdles. I think one of the things I try to point out in my paper is that a democracy, a true liberal democracy, cannot exist where freedom of expression and freedom of religion are so severely curtailed. So there is a great deal of work to be done. As I looked at the situation, I found that there is, there's a great deal of a very different view of religion in Indonesia than in the United States. I think it's easy for Americans to really take religious freedom for granted and think that that's a value that everyone shares, and I don't think that's the case. Even as I found in a Pew study, that even as Indonesians on a large majority, more than 61% of Indonesians, more than about 62% of Indonesians favor democracy and place a high value on religious principles, including freedom of expression. And that's not a huge number, 62%, but it's, I'm sure if you were to poll Americans, it would be much higher. But nevertheless, one has to wonder, well, what does that really mean to them, freedom of expression? That's even kind of a Western, an American term. And we may use that term very differently than the Indonesians. And I haven't been able to really zero in on that. But I thought, nevertheless, the number 62% was kind of low. And then the other thing that I found interesting was that only 61% of the people disapproved of intimidation of the Ahmadiyya sect by other religious groups. Again, one would have to believe that in the United States, if we polled Americans about whether how they felt about intimidating people of different religions, I suspect it would be even a Christian majority would strongly oppose persecution and intimidation of Muslims, for example. So I think we just have certain assumptions that others that don't necessarily translate to other countries. Um, Also, it was interesting to find that they're relatively tolerant of certain amounts of of limitations of religious freedom. For example, 73% of Indonesians, according to this Pew study, disapproved of other religions expanding their presence in Muslim areas by building churches. So again, I think while there may not be a majority there that supports blasphemy laws, there is nevertheless a very different view of religious expression and religious freedom. And what we as Americans, I think, are convinced of that perhaps the rest of the world is not, is that what John F. Kennedy said, that an attack upon the religious or an attack upon the freedoms of one is really an attack upon the freedoms of all. And I think that if you're not the one whose religion and whose liberties are being attacked and restricted, you're less likely to rise up in defense of others whose views are being attacked and limited. And so I think this is where Indonesia, probably this is where a lot of work needs to be done in the area of public diplomacy by the United States in getting out the message, in educating further on what it means to have religious freedom and what religious freedom means to democracy. Another real problem, I think, for Indonesia is its constitution. I think right in the heart of the constitution, embedded in it, in Article 29, is a conflict of purposes, or a conflict of principles. Article 29, Section 1 guarantees a commitment to monotheism. Article 29, Section 2 guarantees the right to practice one's religion freely. And so I think you have this conflict. You can have your right to practice your religion freely as long as your religion is a monotheistic one. And I think those two are at odds. The president of Indonesia has gone on the record at the United Nations calling for global anti-blasphemy legislation. Some would say as a kind of pawn in the hands of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC. I don't know his relation to the OIC particularly, but he is the president of the largest Islamic country in the world by population. So it kind of stands to reason that he would do that. The OIC in its declarations, its agenda, its 10-year plan is devoted to combating Islamophobia. But one has to really be concerned, I think, about the OIC's agenda, because the OIC is really approaching, I think, the whole problem of Islamophobia and discrimination against Islam in a very kind of Islamist way. It's not approaching the problem by saying we need to educate the world about what Islam really stands for. Instead, they're taking the approach of the fundamentalists and saying that governments need to impose religious or have to impose restrictions upon religious speech when that speech is offensive to Islam. I think the OIC is, I don't know what their motivations are, but I think they're really taking the tact of the Islamists and so are really going to, well, I think really their agenda then becomes a threat to our conception of religious liberty. And I think that's going to have to be dealt with. I hope that they will be unsuccessful in their attempts to achieve anti-blasphemy legislation on a worldwide scale. But I hope that the United States will take the leadership in educating the world, including the OIC and its member states, about what we really mean and what we believe about religious freedom. Well, as I mentioned a little earlier on, one of the elements in my policy generation was the use of public diplomacy by the United States to help to bring a more liberal understanding of democracy and freedom of religion and expression to the to Indonesia, but really broadly to the Muslim world throughout South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And the goal would be, I think, to allow Islamic scholars who have a more broad, more westernized, more um, liberal view of these fundamental freedoms to reach the audience out there of Muslims who are 1 billion, nearly 1 billion of whom are living in 14 countries that have highly restrictive um, laws when it comes to religious freedom and religious expression. Nearly 1 billion Muslims are living in countries where other religions don't have the same freedom to operate, to witness, to proselytize. People in many of these countries are not free to challenge and to ask tough questions and to sort of hold the Quran and the Islamic faith up to scrutiny, up to rational scrutiny. I really think the United States must vigorously oppose any further encroachment of religious freedom, any encroachment of anti-blasphemy laws on a global scale. The United States should reject. And we really need to take a close look at any kind of hate speech legislation, which, according to Nina Shea and Paul Marshall from the Hudson Institute, are really just nothing more than guise for Sharia, a guise for Islamic anti-blasphemy legislation. Americans should feel free to speak and to write and to publish and not to worry that there's going to be a price upon their heads. And so the United States, I'm not the expert on law enforcement, but I think the United States needs to say, if you put a price on an American's head for an exercise of liberty, we will take action against you. Whether we're going to put a price on your head, whatever law enforcement action needs to take place, I think that's what the United States needs to do. You cannot, by terrorist means, restrict the liberties and the freedoms of our people. You cannot threaten them with terroristic violence and thereby silence them, cause them to not say, not publish. That's unacceptable. And that really is, I think, a fundamental role the government needs to play in guaranteeing our liberties. We should not feel in fear to stand in our own country and to say what's on our minds. So I think the United States needs to really take these 3 steps. It needs to proclaim liberty through public diplomacy means. We need to stand for liberty by opposing legislation that would threaten it. And we need to defend our liberty by swiftly and in some manner clearly and plainly saying we will not allow terrorist threats against our citizens to stand, particularly threats against our liberties. That is a summary of my paper, and I thank you for watching.